Hey everybody, welcome to chapter 17 on factorial ANOVA. Now, this is almost certainly the most challenging chapter of the entire semester, but the good news is if you're able to master the content of this chapter, that means that you know basically everything there is to know about an introduction to statistics in psychological science. So, this is kind of for all the marbles, right? But once you get this down, you're going to be in a really good position to go on to grad school if that's something you're interested in, and potentially get employed because of the newfound skills that you'll have. So, without further ado, let's dive in. First up, let's do some review. So, which of the following is or are true for a one-way ANOVA? You have one categorical independent variable and one numeric dependent variable. Yes, that is true. The categorical independent variable can have any number of levels. Typically for an ANOVA, we're talking about 3 or more levels. The omnibus F-test tells you which of the group means are different from each other. That's false. The omnibus F-test is just the overall test of the ANOVA model, and if it's significant, it just says at least 2 of these group means are different from each other. 2 of however many levels you have. At least that many. It could be more, right? But you don't actually know. C, if you have a non-significant omnibus F test, then you conduct pairwise comparisons between each level of the independent variable. That is false. If you have a non-significant F test, then you don't even keep going because you're just done at that point. It's not worth continuing on. D, you have 2 different degrees of freedom terms. That is true. That is true. You've got 2 different degrees of freedom terms. One of the degrees of freedom is going to tell you the number of levels you have for the independent variable minus 1 is one of the degrees of freedom terms. The other degrees of freedom terms, the degrees of freedom within, is going to be the total number of people in your study minus the number of levels, essentially, from your independent variable. So degrees of freedom between is number of levels minus 1. Degrees of freedom within is number of people in your study minus number of levels. All right. So I want to start with a conceptual example. And this is a good question even to ask yourself in your own life. Like, in what situation / context am I the happiest? So this is worth pondering and maybe even worth experimenting with. So the dependent variable, the outcome that we're interested in measuring in this study is our happiness. Okay, well, let's say we're going to measure happiness on a self-reported scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being I'm absolutely ecstatic, this is the happiest time ever, and 1 being this is the worst, I don't like it at all. So let's say we've got one independent variable, also called a factor, and that is location. That is where you are physically. So let's say that this independent variable of location has 3 different levels. It has camping is one place, a house party is another location, and then being in Paris. You could, substitute that with any international type of travel. So far we could see what is the effect of these different locations on our happiness, meaning maybe there will be a significant difference in average happiness between all of these locations. But what if we want to add a second variable or factor, which is the social situation that you're going to also be in? So this would have 2 levels. You're either alone or you're with your best friend. And now we can say, okay, well, how does the social situation itself affect my happiness? Just thinking about being alone versus average happiness when you're with your best friend. So far we can ask, what is the effect of location on our happiness? We can also ask, what is the effect of the social situation on our happiness? But also there's a third option which combines those 2 variables. Does my happiness in one location depend on whether I'm with my best friend or if I'm alone? Because it could be that maybe, let's say, camping makes you more happy when you're alone versus being at a party makes you more happy when you're with your best friend, right? So your happiness on one of those variables depends on the level of the second variable. Things are getting a little bit more complex. And this is where factorial designs comes in. Specifically, we're talking about factorial ANOVA designs. And factorial, that word, refers literally to factors, multiple factors, which are the different independent variables that are going to affect our outcome variable, our dependent variable. So using factorial designs, we can actually study the effects of more than one independent variable on the dependent variable, which is something we have not done so far this semester. You can also examine the effects of more than one variable when they're combined, when their combined effects together are going to be influencing the outcome. And we'll talk more about that in this chapter. So just a refresher from last chapter on one-way ANOVA, we're talking about levels of independent variables. Now, in last chapter, we were just talking about one factor, meaning one independent variable, which was the type of format a textbook was in. The outcome variable was student satisfaction ratings. And that factor, that one independent variable, had 3 different levels. It had paper textbook, standard electronic textbook, and interactive electronic textbook. All right, but now our example is going to get a bit more complicated. So we had the one factor, one independent variable of textbook format with 3 different levels: paper text, standard electronic text, and interactive electronic texts. And now we're going to add on to that another factor, a second factor or independent variable, which is subject topic. And it could have any number of levels for however many subjects you're talking about, but in this case, we're going to have 2 levels, psychology and chemistry. So now there are going to be students who are going to be reviewing a paper text for a psychology textbook and a paper text for a chemistry textbook. Students who will be reviewing psychology standard electronic text, chemistry standard electronic text, and students who are going to be reviewing psychology interactive electronic text and chemistry interactive electronic texts. So you can see there's actually going to be 6 different conditions, and what we're interested in is 2 separate main effects, what they're called main effects. One main effect of textbook format, how does that affect student satisfaction ratings as the outcome? Also, how does subject topic by itself, psychology versus chemistry, how does that affect student satisfaction ratings? But more interestingly, do these factors interact? Do these 2 variables of textbook format and subject topic, do they interact to predict student satisfaction ratings in a particular way? For example, some students could really prefer a paper text for a psychology textbook, but other students could really prefer an interactive electronic text specifically for the chemistry topic, right? So we want to see not only how are these things separate from each other, the formats affecting student satisfaction ratings on their own, but also whether there's some interaction effects there. So in these kinds of factorial designs, you have different kinds of effects of independent variables on dependent variables. The main effect is a test of the effect of each independent variable on their own with the dependent variable. So for instance, in that example we just talked about, we've got 2 different main effects. We've got one main effect, which is the effect of textbook format on student satisfaction. We've also got a second main effect, which is the effect of subject topic, psychology or chemistry, on student satisfaction. But something new that we haven't seen so far this semester is called the interaction effect. And this is testing the effect of one of those independent variables at each of the levels of the other independent variable. Okay, so it'll be its own type of test, and a significant interaction effect, a p of less than or equal to 0.05, or if we find that the effect lies in the critical region and we reject the null, then what we can say is that the effect of one of the independent variables depends on the level of the other independent variable. So for instance, if we found a significant interaction effect in this example, it would mean that student satisfaction ratings of the textbook format depends on whether those students are taking psychology or they're taking chemistry. Now, if there's a significant interaction effect, it also means the reverse. So not only is it that student satisfaction of the textbook format depends on which subject the students are taking, it would also simultaneously mean that the student satisfaction of the subject, either chemistry or psychology, depends on which textbook format they have for those classes. So both things will be simultaneously true if we find a significant interaction effect, but we're only going to be covering it basically from like one of those standpoints, even though it is true for both of them. A slightly more complicated interpretation of an interaction effect would be that we're comparing the differences between the levels of one of the independent variables, so differences between textbook formats, let's say, across or at each of the levels of subject. So we would be comparing the differences between the textbook formats in psychology to the differences between textbook formats in chemistry. So hopefully that makes sense. That's how an interaction works. It'll make more sense as we talk through it today. Also, we should definitely note that we can make separate hypotheses about each of the main effects, which there are two of in this example, as well as the interaction effect. So we'll talk about the hypotheses in just a second. So studying multiple factors and interaction effects is really important, and we do it all the time in psychology because usually we're interested in how a lot of factors combine to affect some kind of behavior or emotional response or whatever it is in humans, okay? So it's very, very common, I would say the vast majority of research that you'll ever come across involves more than one independent variable looking at one or maybe two or maybe more dependent variables, which we also won't really talk about this semester. But an example of this is like, well, in physical therapy, for example, if you like, tear some ligament in your knee or something like that, well, how well you recover from that is going to depend on at least two factors, probably a lot more, but at least two. First of all, if you have to get it surgically repaired, well, then the skill of the surgeon is definitely going to impact your functionality after the surgery. Second of all, how well you adhere to a PT, physical therapy training regimen after the surgery will also depend on how much usefulness or how much range of motion or how much, whatever you get out of that knee afterwards. So it's not really appropriate in that specific situation to just talk about the surgery. It's not appropriate to just talk about the physical therapy. Both things had to happen together to get somebody full functionality back, right? Same thing you might think about like certain types of drugs affecting people only when they have certain types of genes, genetics, right? And so there's usually more than one factor that's affecting some kind of outcome that we're interested in. And you might not find any effects of one independent variable on the outcome, but when you start looking at it in combination with other things, then you find that, oh, these two things work together in tandem to actually cause this effect downstream in psychology and biology and microbiology, any of those kinds of things. So it's very common, and yeah, it's a good thing to know how to do. So let's actually get into how to conduct a two-way ANOVA. It's going to go through the same 5 hypothesis testing steps we've been doing all semester, but of course, it's going to look a little bit different. And by the way, a two-way ANOVA means there are two factors. There's two independent variables, and they could have any number of levels, but it's specifically talking about two independent variables with one dependent variable. I wanted to talk about this a little bit. Your book makes a big deal about how many more subjects or participants we need for a two-way ANOVA kind of design, and that's absolutely true. When you're thinking about factors in a two-way ANOVA and study design in general, you have to ask yourself, okay, are these between subjects factors or within subjects factors? Or do I want one of each, which gets very complicated, and that's called a mixed model ANOVA. We're not going to talk about that. For our case, both of these factors, both the textbook format and the subject, are between subjects factors because we're assigning different people to all of these things, right? We're gonna grab 60 people from a student body and, well, 180 people from a student body, 60 plus 60 plus 60, and send 60 of them to be assigned to read a textbook that's paper format. 60 of them are going to do standard electronic, 60 will do interactive. And then even within those three groups, we split up again into two different groups where 30 students are going to read a psychology textbook using whatever text format that group is. 30 are going to read a chemistry textbook using whatever text format that is. So you need a lot more people to basically try to get results, and that's why two-way models or even more complex models and designs can be tough because you have to get a lot more people to power the study essentially. So we're leveling up from one-way ANOVA, which only had one hypothesis. It was only testing the effect of the levels of one independent variable on outcome. Now we're going to have to not just go from one test to two tests or one hypothesis to two hypotheses. It's actually 1 to 3 hypotheses and 3 tests because now we're testing two main effects and their interaction. So we're actually going to have to go conduct essentially 3 ANOVAs. So in step 1 of hypothesis testing, right, we're going to state our hypotheses. And we need 3 different hypotheses because we're going to test 3 different things. This first hypothesis is for the main effect of just textbook format. Okay, so the null hypothesis is going to be just like a one-way ANOVA from last chapter. The population means for student satisfaction using paper, standard electronic, and interactive electronic texts are all equal, meaning none of the textbook formats are going to have significantly different student satisfaction ratings. That's what the null hypothesis would say. The alternative hypothesis, H1, could be one of many possible things. You could say, well, I think all of the means will be different from each other. I could say at least one of the means is going to be different from the others. Here we have the example of the population mean for the interactive electronic format is going to be higher than the rest of the population means for the other two kinds of text format. Now we have to make a second hypothesis for the main effect of the subject topic. Okay, so the null hypothesis, now there's only 2 levels here. So this is essentially like an independent samples t-test, but it's okay, you can use the F distribution to do this also. So the null hypothesis is that the population mean satisfaction, student satisfaction for psychology and chemistry texts are equal. They're not different from each other. Whereas the alternative hypothesis is going to be the population means for psychology and chemistry are not equal to each other. And finally, we have a third hypothesis, which is specifically for the interaction effect between text format and subject topic. So the null hypothesis is pretty straightforward. There is no interaction effect in the population. Remember, hypotheses are always about populations, not samples, for text format and subject topic on student satisfaction. So it's talking about both of those things combined to have an effect on student satisfaction. Alternative hypothesis, well, there is an interaction effect in the population for text format and subject topic on student satisfaction. Step 2, we're going to set our decision criterion. As always, we're going to be using an alpha level of 0.05. In step 3, we actually have to recruit those 180 participants and assign them basically to 6 different conditions. There's 3 conditions or 3 levels of the text format variable, and there's 2 levels of the subject variable, and so you end up having basically 3 times 2, 6 different conditions that you have to sort people into. And hopefully you do this with random assignment in the best case scenario. Some designs might not allow for that though. So since your first factor has 3 levels and your second factor has 2 levels, this is also called a 3 by 2 design. If you had 2 different factors and both of those factors only have 2 levels, well then it's a 2 by 2 design, right? So this one's a 3 by 2 design. And of course in step 4 we actually need to calculate the F ratios or F values for each of these 3 different tests we're conducting. 2 tests for the effects of main effect 1 and main effect 2, and then the test for the effect of the interaction term. So we have to think about, well, what statistics do we actually need in order to calculate between and within groups variance for these F ratios? Because we're going to have 3 different F ratios. Well, it's going to get a little complicated here, and so bear with me, and we'll walk through it together. Okay, this is a very busy slide, and I think the next slide might be even busier. So let's walk through what the heck is going on here. So basically, you'll see in the middle of the diagram that we have 6 boxes. These are also called cells, 6 cells. And each of those cells contains a condition mean. A mean of what? The mean student satisfaction rating for that condition. And so, like I said, we split up those 180 people, 180 students, into 6 different mutually exclusive conditions. There's no participants that are in multiple of these conditions. Okay, so we've got 30 people in the upper left box that has a mean equal to 5.4. That condition is people who have a psychology textbook and it is the paper version of that textbook. Okay, there's 30 people in that, and they all gave a satisfaction rating, and the average of those 30 people's satisfaction ratings for the paper psychology textbook is 5.4. Cool. I assume this is out of 10. The box right below that is for the 30 people who are assigned to the condition of reading a chemistry text, and also it's the paper version of that chemistry text, and they gave a mean satisfaction rating of 5.2. Cool. Okay, now what's all this stuff outlined in red? These are the marginal means, and basically what's happening here is, let's take the column again of just the paper text. Okay, that column touches both psychology and chemistry. The paper psychology textbook has an average rating of 5.4. Paper chemistry textbook has an average rating of 5.2. If you average 5.4 and 5.2 together, you get a new mean, which is 5.3, and that is the marginal mean for the paper textbook format. Okay. What you do in a two-way ANOVA is you calculate all of these marginal means, which just means you take the means of each of the conditions and you average them for each level of each variable. So what do I mean by that? All right, now let's look at rows instead of columns. Let's look at the psychology row. So it looks like for psychology textbooks, the paper version has a mean satisfaction rating of 5.4. The standard electronic version of the psychology book has a mean satisfaction of 6.2, and the interactive electronic version has a mean satisfaction of 8.8. So that seems to be, the preferred, at least for psychology textbooks. Interactive electronic got the highest average satisfaction score. Well, if you average 5.4, 6.2, and 8.8 across that psychology row, now you get a marginal mean on the upper right there of 6.8. That is the marginal mean for psychology as a subject topic. Okay, and so what you do when you create these marginal means, you're basically averaging out one of the levels of the opposite independent variable. So in that case, we have the marginal mean of 6.8 for psychology, basically ignores all of the individual means for the paper version, the standard electronic version, the interactive electronic version, because what we're trying to do when we make these marginal means is look at just main effects, okay? Just main effects. And so what I would want to do is if I was trying to compare, well, what's the main effect of this subject topic? Meaning, does psychology versus chemistry, do those have significantly different satisfaction means between those two things, psychology versus chemistry textbooks? Well, in order to do that, I have to find some way of getting rid of the other independent variable because that makes it too complicated. There's too many numbers. So I average across all of the textbook formats and I get marginal means for psychology of 6.8, marginal mean for chemistry of 6.3. Now I just have two numbers to compare. Well, what's that? Well, that's just an independent t-test. You can do it with an ANOVA too, though. Then I just have to compare 6.8 to 6.3, and that gives me the main effect for subject topic. If I wanted the main effect for textbook format, well, I take the paper version and I average the psychology and chemistry means to get a marginal mean of 5.3. If I want the standard electronic mean, marginal mean, I average 6.2 and 7.2 from psychology and chemistry to make 6.7. And I do the same thing for interactive electronic. So now if I just want to see, well, what's the main effect of just the textbook format, not paying attention to whether it's psychology or chemistry, now I have three means that I can compare using a one-way ANOVA. We've done that before. The mean of 5.3, 6.7, and 7.6. And I will conduct an ANOVA test on that to see if any of those are significantly different from the other ones, I should say. Notice also that in the bottom right-hand corner, we have a grand mean. And that is what happens when you average. Either you can average all 6 of the cells together to make the grand mean, or you can average all of the marginal means together to get the grand mean. Note that that only works if you have even sample sizes in every single cell, though. We're going to use this grand mean to help us calculate the between groups variance. Now, what if I wanted to look for an interaction effect? Well, it's a lot easier to look for interaction effects if you actually just plot these means, these cell means, the condition means, on a graph. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. So what you can do is take each of those 6 condition means and actually plot them on a graph. This is a bar graph that comes from your textbook. I would definitely do this as line graphs because it makes it way easier to tell if there's an interaction. But basically you look for patterns in the way that these bars or lines are distributed, and you can actually see whether there are main effects or an interaction effect. The first thing you're going to notice is that if we just look at the psychology subject, we've got a bar for each of the textbook formats, right? The darkest one is for the paper format, and then it ranges all the way up to the interactive. So if we just look at that side of the graph for now, it looks like for psychology specifically, the interactive electronic version of that textbook got the highest rating from students. All right, cool. If we jump over to the other side of the graph on the right side, just looking at the chemistry topic, now we've got to look again at these different formats. But there's not as clear of a pattern. It looks like, okay, the standard electronic has a bit higher of a satisfaction rating, but we don't know if these things are significantly different, and it's hard to tell from what's going on here. Are there main effects? Is there an interaction effect? And so what I would do is turn this into a line graph. So imagine that you just take the point at the middle top of each of these bars. That becomes a single point, and you can connect them like I've done here so that the paper version, the paper format, is connected with a line between psychology and chemistry. The standard electronic version is connected with a line between psychology and chemistry, and the interactive electronic version of the textbook is connected with a line. And what you do to check for interactions is basically look for non-parallel lines, especially so if you see lines that crisscross or overlap with each other, such as when you see the lines for the standard electronic and interactive electronic actually converge at a point, they cross over. That is an indication that yes, there is probably a significant interaction. Now we'd still have to run calculations, which we're going to do, to see if there is a significant interactive effect. Okay, so let's get back to these F-tests, and we have to conduct 3 different F-tests. Again, 2 for the different main effects, 1 for the interaction, and we're going to compare what we find, each of those 3 F ratios or F results, to 3 different F critical values that are determined using the F table with appropriate degrees of freedom, which we're going to calculate in a minute. So recall that the F-test or F ratio consists of the mean squares between over the mean squares within, also known as the between group variance over the within group variance. Okay, so that's this top formula. That's what we need to get to. Well, in order to get to the mean squares, we need, for each of those, the between and the within, we need to calculate sums of squares between and degrees of freedom between, and then sums of squared within and degrees of freedom within, right? So let's start with the top part of that, the numerator of the F ratio. Sums of squares for the between, sums of squares format is what it's called in this case, is the number of people in each cell, which is n, times b. B is the number of levels of the other independent variable, the other factor, so that is subject, which has a total of 2 factors, or I'm sorry, 2 levels. Multiply that by the sum of each of the levels of format minus the grand mean, squared all of that. Okay, so we'll get to those calculations in a second. The degrees of freedom between for format is equal to the level of groups, or the number of levels, I'm sorry, minus 1. Well, that one's easy. Well, we've got 3 different kinds of text formats. You subtract 1 from that, and you get 2. This slide goes more into detail for the sums of squares, so definitely take a chance to pause the video and take a look here. So the sums of squares between for textbook format is going to be 30, which is the sample size for each of these conditions, times 2, that's the 2 levels from subject, psychology and chemistry, and then you multiply all of that by each of the marginal means for each of the levels of format minus the grand mean. You square all that stuff. And you can go back to the 6-cell table that we had to see where you get all these numbers from. But basically, you end up with a sums of squares of 161.2. And then you divide that by the degrees of freedom we found on a couple slides ago, which is 2. And you get, finally, a mean squared between of 80.6. And we still need to calculate a within groups variance, or a mean squared within, but it turns out that it's the same for all of the F tests. So we can calculate it at the end, and we won't have to worry about calculating a different version of the within groups variance for each of the 3 hypothesis tests that we're doing. But now we do need to move on to the second main effect, and again, this is just for the between groups variance. This is just for the numerator of the F ratio. Well, we basically use the same formula, but the degrees of freedom and the formula change very, very slightly, because now we have, it's the number of subjects, 30, times A, which is actually the number of levels of the other independent variable, which is format, right? And so there are 3 levels of format. So it'll be slightly different when we're calculating the between groups variance for subject. Degrees of freedom of subject is going to be, instead of A1 minus 1, it's going to be B minus 1, just because this is like the B variable. But again, it's just the number of levels or number of groups. So there were 2 different levels, psychology and chemistry. You subtract 1 from that, and you get 1. If we use the marginal means, you can go back again and check out the marginal means for the subject topic in that 6-celled diagram that we had earlier. If we input all of this stuff, so 30 is the sample size, 3 is the number of levels of the opposite independent variable, and then you input the 2 different marginal means minus the grand means, square those. All right, you get 11.34 for the sums of squared between for just subject topic, and you divide that by the degrees of freedom of subject topic, which we found on the last slide was just 1. So the overall mean squared, or mean squared for subject topic, also known as the between groups variance for subject topic, is 11.34. Again, this is the numerator of the F ratio. And finally, we have to calculate the between groups variance for the interaction term. Now, this uses quite a different formula for the sums of squares and for the degrees of freedom. So definitely take your time to walk through that, and the book can help you with that as well. But otherwise, we're still just doing the same thing, trying to find the mean squared for this interaction, which is the sum of squares over the degrees of freedom. And the equation for the sums of squares between for the interaction term incorporates condition means, it incorporates marginal means for both of the independent variables and the grand means. So there's tons and tons and tons of numbers that go into this, and definitely you'll want to flip back and forth between this and that table that we saw earlier to see where these numbers end up. But finally, you see a sums of squares between for the interaction of 88.98. And just to get that into the mean squares of the interaction, which again is the between groups variance for the interaction, you would take 88.98 and divide it by the degrees of freedom. In this case, degrees of freedom are the level of the first independent variable minus 1 times the level of the number of levels of the second independent variable minus 1. So basically you get 2 times 1, which is equal to 2. And dividing 88.98 by that 2 degrees of freedom gives you 44.49. Now finally, we can calculate the within groups variance for all of the effects. It's going to be the same number. This is the denominator of the F ratio for all of these tests, all of these effects. So the sums of squares within, you can see, is the sum of individual scores minus the condition means squared. And you would calculate the degrees of freedom within as the number of levels from group A, or from independent variable A, times the number of levels in independent variable B, and then multiply that by the number of people in each group minus 1. So the book just gives you that the sums of squares within is 1,000. We can calculate the degrees of freedom within by saying there's 3 levels of the first variable times 2 levels of the second variable times 30 minus 1, because there's 30 people in each cell. And that gives you a total of 174. So to find the mean squares within, you just take 1,000, divide it by 174, and you get 5.75. So finally, after all of that, you can finally calculate the F statistic, or F ratio, or F value for each of these effects. And so the F value for the main effect of text format becomes 80.6 divided by 5.75, and that gives us 14.02. the main effect, the F value, for just the independent variable of subject topic is 11.34 divided by 5.75. That gives you 1.97. The effect, the interaction effect, F value, is 44.49 divided by 5.75 gives you 7.74. Now you're going to compare all of these F values that we calculated to F critical values from an F table. All right, so we conducted those 3 different hypothesis tests, and I put all of these results into a little table to make it a little easier to interpret what's going on. So in the first row, we've got the main effect of textbook format. You can see that we've got different degrees of freedom, different F values, F critical values, and then the decision to make based on the comparison of the F value observed versus the F critical value, right? So for main effect of text format, we can see that it has 2 and 174 degrees of freedom. The observed F value was 14.02, and the F critical, which you would look up in the back of the book, right? Unfortunately, there isn't a degrees of freedom within of 174. The closest one is 200. So we'll just go with that for now. So if you have a degrees of freedom numerator, degrees of freedom between of 2, and a degrees of freedom for the denominator, or degrees of freedom within of 200, you get 3.04 is your F critical value. You should be able to look that up in the back of the book. So is 14.02 more extreme than an F critical of 3.06? Yes, it is. So that means you reject the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis was that there would be no effect of textbook format. In other words, the average satisfaction rating of students would not be different across the 3 different textbook formats. But we reject that. So it means that at least 2 of the textbook formats are going to be different from each other on average in terms of average student satisfaction ratings, but we don't know which ones yet. So you'd have to do some follow-up pairwise tests for that. How about the main effect of subject topic? Well, it had an F value, an observed F value of 1.97, and the F critical, which you could look up in the book, with 1 and 174 degrees of freedom, really 1 and 200 degrees of freedom, because that's what the textbook has, is 3.89. Okay, so 1.97 is not more extreme than 3.89, so we fail to reject the null hypothesis. Okay, well, if you fail to reject the null hypothesis, and the null hypothesis was that there would be no difference in student satisfaction ratings between psychology and chemistry, then we unfortunately retain that null hypothesis, and we don't have any evidence to suggest that there is a difference in student satisfaction ratings between psychology and chemistry overall. But how about the interaction effect? Well, we've got an observed F value of 7.74, and again, the F crit is going to be equal to 3.04. Well, 7.74 is definitely more extreme. We would lie in the critical region, and therefore we reject the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis in this case is just that there is no interaction effect, but in fact we did find an interaction effect. So let's talk about this in terms of plain English. All right, so for text format, we found a significant effect of text format, which means if we reject the null was that all the population means of student satisfaction are going to be the same for each of the levels of this variable. So for the text, the physical text, and the 2 different kinds of online text. Well, we know that's not true because we rejected the null. So what is the alternative? Well, you can make, there could be a lot of different potential actual results for the alternative. It could be that at least one of the means is significantly different. One of the mean student satisfaction ratings is significantly different from the other 2. Maybe all 3 of those means are significantly different from each other, but we wouldn't know unless we conducted post hoc testing. The subject topic, either psychology or chemistry, that effect was not significant. So that means that we can't reject the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis was that there is no significant differences in the population mean student satisfaction ratings for those 2 courses. And we can't reject that. We don't necessarily think it's true, but we can't reject it either. Now, the interaction effect of text format by, which that little X means by, subject topic, was also significant. There's a significant interaction, and that tells us that the effect of the text format on student satisfaction ratings depends on which subject topic we're actually talking about. And to fully dig into that and describe exactly how those two independent variables relate to each other, we would want to conduct follow-up testing to break down the interaction effect into what is called simple main effects or simple effects. Now that's like a graduate level test, and we might do it. I might show you how to do it when we do the lab. But it definitely takes some doing, and it would be impressive to know how to do that. Let me tell you that you'd be head and shoulders above other students who are graduating from similar classes. Okay, so anyways, all that to say is that we do have a significant interaction effect. Now here's a really important note. Okay, the first thing you should look for when you're doing a factorial ANOVA, so more than a one-way ANOVA, a two-way ANOVA, three-way, four-way, whatever. You should always look for the interaction terms first and see if they're significant. Because if the interaction is significant, that means that the dependent variable is affected by the combined effects of multiple independent variables, which means that it doesn't really matter if the main effects are significant anymore, because you can't really talk about main effects if the interaction term is significant. Why? Again, because, well, yeah, it is true that the whatever version of the textbook you have, physical versus the two different online versions of the textbook, it is true that independently, without subject topic, those things do have a significant significant effect on student satisfaction ratings. But there's more to this picture. You have to talk also about the student satisfaction ratings when you're talking about the class type, the subject topic, and the textbook format together, because it is affected by both of those things. So you're only talking about like half the picture if you only talk about main effects. Hopefully that makes sense, but all that to say, if you see a significant interaction effect, you don't really interpret the main effects anymore. Now, if the interaction effect is not significant, that's cool. Then you look at each main effect separately, as if it were its own one-way ANOVA. And if, like, whichever main effect is significant, maybe one is significant, maybe both of them are significant, you would just follow that up with post hoc testing to actually see, like, which means are significantly different from each other. But you treat them each individually, so you would be doing separate post hoc analyses for each independent variable. So again, we would typically conduct a follow-up test using SPSS to actually break down the interaction effect and see, well, okay, how exactly does the student satisfaction rating depend on both the subject topic and the textbook format? We can get just sort of a brief, bird's eye view of this using the graph, and we talked about this earlier, but it looks like the student satisfaction rating, especially of the interactive online text, really depends on whether the student is in has a psychology textbook or a chemistry textbook, because it's the highest rated for psychology students. They really like the interactive online textbook. But for chemistry, it didn't do as well, right? So you'd have to say, well, do students like the interactive online textbook the most? And your answer as a scientist or as a researcher would be, well, it depends on which subject topic they're participating in. Okay, same thing with the standard online text. Well, it didn't do so well in the psychology course. It was kind of middling, but it was the highest rated in the chemistry, right? So again, it just depends. So what I want you to take away from all this is that if there is a significant interaction effect, it's nice to be able to see a some kind of graph because it really helps you understand how are the condition means changing within one of the variables across the levels of the other variables. So like, how is the interactive electronic text changing from psychology to chemistry? And it's really nice if you have line graphs because if anything basically is non-parallel or overlapping, non-parallel in like a significant way, if they're even a little bit like non-parallel, it doesn't mean there's necessarily an interaction effect. But anyways, if you want to be sure though, you really want to run pairwise comparisons. And we're going to be doing that in R in the next lecture, and I'll show you how that's done. Here's a different example that maybe better illustrates this. So we've taken away the bars, and we just have these nice line graphs to look at. In the upper example, what this study was about is the reporting of pain, let's say the side effects of pain, when taking a specific dose of drugs, and they've split it up between males and females. This upper graph shows this really nice crossover pattern, which indicates that there's definitely going to be an interaction effect. And so what this is saying is the pain reported, which is on the y-axis, by each of the sexes, the male versus female, depends on the dose of drug taken, because you can see if somebody asks you, well, who reported more pain as a side effect of taking these drugs? You would have to say, well, if we just look at the low dose of the drug, which is the left-hand portion, it looks like males definitely reported more pain. They report a pain of 20, and females reported a pain of 10. But if we gave them high doses of drugs, the pattern flipped, such that females reported a pain of 20 and males reported a pain of 10. So these things are interdependent. Now, the bottom graph is showing you parallel lines, right? So there's not going to be an interaction effect, meaning that these two, the effects of the two independent variables, sex and dose of drug, do not interact with each other. They're not dependent on each other to affect the overall pain ratings in this case. So what you might have are significant main effects though. So the main effect of gender here, where males, regardless of the dose of drug, are reporting higher pain consequences, right? Side effects, I should say. And maybe there's also a main effect of the drug dose, such that if you look at it, regardless of whether you're a male or a female, these lines are slanted, right? And so that means that it looks like at low doses of the drug, people are reporting higher pain than at high doses of the drug, regardless of males and females, because both males and females report higher pain during the low dose and lower pain during the high dose. Hopefully that makes some sense. All right, we made it. You guys are champions if you've made it this long. But I know this is a ton of material and it's very complex, but this is kind of the bread and butter of psychology because we oftentimes want to see how multiple independent variables affect a single dependent variable. So we do two-way ANOVA all the time in practice. It's really good to know how to do these things, and I hope that this information is useful and can go on to help you in your future careers. I'll see you in the next one.